My name, though it damns me, is Frank Elwood, and I am a resident of Kingsport, where my family has lived since Thaddeus Elwood first came to that village in 1691. It is true that I was part of the events that led up to the death of Walter Gilman on May the 1st, 1928. It's true also that the source for the lurid tabloid account of those last days, and of Gilman's possible involvement in the disappearance of Władysław Wolejko, were my own statements to the police. There seems no point in denying these things. The tale of those first months of 1928, as it has been written, is accurate enough, and I can point to no portion of it and call it fiction. Still, it is only a portion of the whole truth, and it but touches on things that came before. People, particularly city folk, have a strange inclination to say that such a thing begins here and ends there. It is a comfort, I suppose, but the truth is that all events can trace their roots beyond the obvious beginnings to seeds and origins that may have once seemed innocuous. I think this is as true in the countryside as it is in the city, but the maddening crowd of urban blight may simply weigh too heavy for such memories and details to be retained for too long. To know the truth, to understand the end, you must know the beginning. But where to begin? It has been suggested that my relationship with Gilman began in September of 1927, when he moved into the crumbling edifice on Parsonage Street. But I knew of him before then, for like myself, Gilman worked for Professor Upham, delving deep into theoretical physics and mathematics. Our research, as directed by Upham, was equal to that of the latest theories emerging from the laboratories of Einstein, Planck, and Schrödinger. Upham regularly corresponded and published with the premier minds of the age. Indeed, his paper providing mathematical proof refuting the Bohr-Heisenberg theory of quantum mechanics won high praise from both Böse and Szilard, and formed the base for Einstein's own later assault on the concept. The paper, published in the summer of 1927, even garnered a note from the famed inventor Nikola Tesla, who invited Upham to co-author a paper. It was this joint paper between Tesla and Upham which changed the direction of the work that Gilman had been pursuing. To my knowledge, the manuscript bearing both their names, and which bore the title Historical Evidence for Non-Linear Motion Through Fourth-Dimensional Space, never saw publication. But I presume that it was for this treatise that in the fall of 1927 Upham redirected Gilman to investigate the linkages between various quantum theories and certain schools of elder magic. Upham invoked his academic standing to gain Gilman access to the medieval metaphysics collection, an act that annoyed a score of history and philosophy students, and drew protests from several other faculty members and at least 2 department chairs. Upham dealt with these distractions, ordering Gilman to wade through the vast holdings in search of evidence that some of the forbidden and secret knowledge of old may have been hidden examples of current breakthroughs in modern math and physics. Gilman took to the work with glee, and by the end of October had filled several notebooks with possible linkages between modern spatial theories and several branches of mystical teachings, particularly those related by John Dee in his treatise Monas Hieroglyphica, and to a lesser extent in Prin's De Vermis Mysteriis. Upham was pleased, and urged Gilman to delve deeper into the morass of ancient and foreboding texts. Gilman's studies were not without obstacles. Armitage, the old librarian, put limits on Gilman's access to the rarer texts, particularly Dee's translation of the Necronomicon, to which he was limited to but an hour each day. Here, then, is the irony of the situation, for it is in the limitations placed upon his use of the Necronomicon that drove poor Gilman to peruse other sources. Sources such as the trial journals of Judge John Haythorne, whose details on his encounters with a number of the accused witches would lead Gilman to an obsession with Kaziah Mason that would in the end cost him his life. From Haythorne's papers Gilman learned how in 1692, at the height of the witch panic, court officers seized Kaziah Mason on the road from Innsmouth and brought her bound and shackled before the court. It was 3 days of torture before she admitted to being a witch and revealed to Judge Haythorne her secret name of Nahab. There were places like the desolate island in the Miskatonic River and the dark valley beyond Meadow Hill, where she would meet with the Black Man and draw curves and lines that would open doors to spaces beyond space and between space, and to the planets seen in the sky and beyond. She was, she claimed, a vessel for the Black Goat, and through her had passed the Dark 100, and from them would arise the 1,000 young, and then the 1,000,000 favoured ones. Here Mason broke into a strange quote that Gilman recognised as a translation from Prynne's De Vermis Mysteriis. For the Black Goat Mother doth favour her servants with such fruitfulness that would shame even the most fertile of pestilent flies, breeding in the secret wounds of man's misery and pain, like maggots in a slaughter-yard. Haythorne was so disturbed by Mason's testimony that he ordered her to await execution in a windowless underground chamber, chained to a wall, her mouth gagged, her hands and fingers bound. Despite all such precautions, the next morning Haythorne found the prison guard mad, babbling about a horrid rat thing that had scurried out of her cell. Of Kaziah Mason there was no trace, only a series of strange devices, of angled lines and broken curves, painted onto the wall using a viscous red fluid Haythorne refused to identify, remained to mark her passage. As astounding a story as it was Haythorne's skilled renderings of the symbols found in Mason's cell that so intrigued Gilman. Although primitive, and whether that was a result of Haythorne's sketch or of the original state of the symbols themselves, they bore striking resemblances to the recent geometrically recursive works of Helga von Koch and Wacław Sierpiński, exactly the kind of thing Upham had been looking for. Gilman pursued this direction, poring through the antiquated library catalogues for days, but to little avail. The little old ladies who formed the core of the library reference staff, to whom he posed his questions and begged for assistance, would only shake their heads and wander away to attend to other duties. That Walter Gilman was not from Arkham may have had some part in this gentle rebuff. True, he had some family in the area. There were still Gilmans in Innsmouth, where Walter's grandparents had left in 1846. But this relationship provided no advantage, for the residents of Arkham have no fondness for those of Innsmouth. Possibly it was not the taciturn nature of Arkhamites, nor their native prejudice against those of Innsmouth that stalled Gilman's researches into Kaziah Mason. Rather it may have been being from Haverhill itself, easily noticed from the particular accent that Gilman spoke with, that was itself the cause for many to avoid him. For many of the residents of Arkham could not help but blame those from Haverhill for the sickness that had started in that small town in 1926, and which had spread, carried by careless farmers and less than reputable dairymen. The sickness that had swept through the town, an illness of aching joints and low fevers accompanied by strange and horrid hallucinations, was born of unsanitary practices, and claimed a dozen or so lives amongst the Haverhill farms. But that was a fraction of the number it killed in Arkham before it burns itself out. They called it the Haverhill fever, which was a polite term used by polite people. The older doctors and the less genteel folk who lived and worked among the slaughter-houses, factories and wharves of Arkham called it by another, more common name: rat-bite madness. It was in September of 1927 that Gilman had a breakthrough, and learned that the home of Kaziah Mason was still extant. His plodding through local history had turned up a rare and somewhat forgotten treatise, A History of Miskatonic Valley, by Pastor Everett L. Watkins, of the small but respected Arkham College, located mere blocks from the hallowed halls of Miskatonic University itself. Here, then, was a compendium, not only of the general history of the city, but of its scandals, secrets, and rumours. Watkins had succumbed to the 1905 typhoid plague, but before that he had worked for the Historical Society, and before that for the Arkham Bulletin. He knew things about Arkham and the people in it that most would rather have forgotten. He wrote about the Panic of 1869, during which some of the finer homes in the city were burned down, and also of the young Latimer girl who was killed by wild dogs in 1884. Watkins had taken photographs of the man who had built the University Observatory, and had filed notice 12 years later when the same man had died in the local madhouse. To him, those dark days of witch haunts and trials weren't just history. To him they were vital occurrences, which still lingered, permeating the landscape and moulding events in Arkham even into the beginning of the 20th century. He had known Arkham, like some men know their wives. He knew her joys and beauties, her mercies and loves, but he knew her faults, her weaknesses, her dirty secrets, and the lies she liked to tell herself. And for all of it, Watkins had loved Arkham, her stately homes, her dockside warehouses, her crumbling alleyways just the same. It was from Watkins's book that Gilman learned that the old house was just a block away from the university, on Parsonage Street. The house itself was nothing of note, a great box of a building with a gambrel roof, and the limited amount of charm that such examples of early colonial architecture hold. Years of neglect had not improved its appeal, and the entire neighbourhood seemed blighted by its presence. Finding the exterior of the witch house wholly unremarkable, Gilman had actually paid the landlord to allow him to explore several of the vacant rooms, and had even gone so far as to crawl up into the attic. It was during this exploration that Gilman inadvertently discovered that I resided in the mouldering old edifice, and enlisted, one could even say forced, my aid in researching the legends surrounding the house and its original owner. Our principal source was Watkins's text, which itself used a variety of older sources, including diaries, journals, and various village and private records, to build a brief biography of Kaziah Mason. Most of the stories of Kaziah begin with the end, with the accusations, the trial, and her mysterious escape. But in 1692 Kaziah was some 50 years old, and few people tell or even know who she was or what she did prior to the scenario that ended her life. She is remembered as the Witch of Arkham, but in those days Arkham was a much smaller place and still in the shadow of Kingsport. Like many of the time, Kaziah wasn't even from Arkham, and you can't tell the tale of how Kaziah came to Arkham without telling of her sisters as well. The Mason triplets, Abigail, Hephzibah, and Kaziah, were born August 20th, 1637 in Kingsport, to Elizabeth Tolby and her husband Roger Mason, captain and owner of the brig Cordelia East. Much is known of the Masons, for they were an active family and well respected throughout the village. A year after the birth of his daughters, Roger Mason met with Arthur Marsh and Benjamin Corey. Together the three formed the Kingsport Mercantile Company, which by 1639 maintained a fleet of 7 ships plying the Caribbean trade. Even today, Kingsport Mercantile maintains vast brick warehouses along the river downstream of Arkham. In 1640, tragedy struck Kingsport and the Masons in particular, when a great storm blew in from the south, sinking 3 ships in the harbour, destroying 16 homes and killing 12 men, women, and children. The death of these poor souls, including Kaziah Mason, is an established fact documented in municipal and church records. By all accounts, and by my own investigation, the grave of the child Kaziah Mason can be found in the old burying ground near the centre of Kingsport. There is no doubt that the girl born to Elizabeth and Roger Mason died that day in 1640. It is from the diary of Dr. Joseph Hillstrom, in an entry dated April the 12th, 1652, that the story of Kaziah Mason begins again. For it was on the morning of this date that a frantic Hephzibah Mason appeared on Hillstrom's doorstep. A violent storm had lashed the coast the previous night, and in the morning the shoreline had been littered with the wreckage of some unknown ship. Combing the beach, the Masons had found, clinging to the debris, the body of a young girl, chilled to the bone, but still alive. Hillstrom found the girl unconscious, cold to the touch, and obviously suffering from long exposure to the icy waters of the bay and beach. That she had survived some terrible ordeal was obvious. Yet how she had survived was what puzzled Hillstrom the most, for even now, after being wrapped in blankets and set next to the fire, the girl was colder than the doctor thought a breathing person could be. Still, it was the girls Abigail and Hephzibah who noticed the most startling thing about the child, and thus Dr. Hillstrom went about making silhouettes of all three girls to confirm the observation. For the strange unconscious girl that the Mason children had found on the beach had the same features and profile as the Mason twins themselves. Indeed, had he not known it to be otherwise, the strange girl could easily have passed for either one of the twins. It was on the second day that the foundling began to stir and slowly regained consciousness and opened her eyes. It was immediately plain that although she understood the words spoken to her, she herself was unable to speak. Likewise, while she could read, any attempts to have the child write ended in failure. At a loss of what to call the girl, but recognizing that the child needed a name, Elizabeth Mason declared that God had, in his mercy, returned to them their Kaziah. In the village, a meeting was held to discuss the girl's welfare, and whether it was proper to commit her to the Masons' care. While much was made of the burden already carried by the captain and his wife, none would step forward to oppose Elizabeth Mason's claim on the child. While her ability to speak and even write words remained lost, she seemed to possess an uncanny skill with numbers and reading. This talent first manifested as she watched Roger balance books and write out missives to those who owed the Kingsport Mercantile Company money. Without the benefit of pen or paper, it seemed the girl was able to carry out complex arithmetic tasks, and even calculate interest in her head. On many occasions she would point to calculations in which Roger had made simple or even complex errors, and then gesture towards numbers that formed the correct answer. It was in this manner that Kaziah first learned to write, not with the alphabet, but with numbers. By the end of June, Roger Mason had moved the girl beyond numbers, and by August she had mastered the Masons' entire meagre library, including 3 volumes in Latin and 1 in Greek. Much was made of the events that occurred that September, when Kaziah spent nearly an hour going through the accounts of several local tradesmen. That the accounting showed that the men had been systematically cheating the Kingsport Mercantile Company was apparent. Roger had suspected such a thing, but when Kaziah transcribed her mental calculations onto paper, it revealed the most curious of things. Whilst Kaziah seemed perfectly capable of handling series of arithmetic calculations including addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division in the most normal of ways, it was not the method that she preferred. Going through her notes, Roger would find characters wholly unknown to him. When he confronted the girl about the strange symbols, Kaziah was fearful at first, but demonstrated to her adoptive father how each symbol functioned to integrate several mathematical operations into one. That using such notation allowed her to indicate the summation of vast sets of numbers hinted that she was what we would today call a prodigy. Roger and his wife recognized it as a fabulous gift, but warned her not to let any strangers see her use it. In the fall of that year, Captain Mason went to sea, leaving his wife and children behind. It was then that some women of the village complained to Elizabeth about the children's education, particularly in the areas of cooking, sewing, and farming. Without such skills, Kaziah would never gain a husband, and never have children. When Grace Watkins mentioned as much to Kaziah, the girl smiled and shook her head, scrawling out a note that indicated, since she never planned to marry, she saw no point in learning such skills. The Watkins women berated Elizabeth on the subject, and a few days later, after much cajoling, Kaziah joined her sisters in household chores, including preparing food and cooking. It was in the process of learning how to cook that the next step in Kaziah's development was made, for it was while making a stew that the pot boiled over and scalded Kaziah's hand. Thus it was quite by accident that Kaziah Mason found her voice and began to scream. Within a week of the accident, Kaziah was speaking, albeit haltingly. By November, Kaziah had joined her family in singing several hymns at church services, and that very same week engaged the Reverend Phillips in an extensive discussion, covering subjects best left to advanced seminary students. That the debate occurred in both English and Latin became the subject of whispered gossip throughout the village. When Roger returned in December, he was greeted by a chorus of song from all three daughters. By the end of August 1653, the twins had reached their 16th birthday, and with them Kaziah celebrated hers as well. Over the course of the next several months, the girls began working side by side with Roger at the Kingsport Mercantile Company, acting as clerks and doing odd chores about the office and public store, and on occasion with Elizabeth as midwives. The first few weeks of this venture were fraught with issues, the foremost of which were the twins' lack of skill and speed in handling numbers and the inventory. This changed rapidly, and more so than Roger Mason would have thought possible. When Roger discovered that the twins' progress was primarily a response to Kaziah teaching the two her strange but efficient mathematical system, he was not surprised in the least. In September the twins became afflicted with their first bout of the curse. Now normally, such an event wouldn't be worth mentioning in polite company or otherwise, but in this case it had a profound impact on Kaziah, who seemed both perplexed and irate over her own failure in the same regard. Both Elizabeth and Goodwife Hillstrom tried to explain the situation to her, and went so far as demonstrating the use of clean rags to capture the flow. Unfortunately, the demonstration seemed to enrage Kaziah, who grabbed one of her sister's wasted rags and ran from the house. Her family searched for her all that night, finding her just as dawn broke in the woods that dotted Kingsport Head. She was asleep, feverish, and her face and mouth were bloody. She slept the next day away, occasionally moaning and muttering in some strange language. Dr. Hillstrom recorded some of these utterings that he could not identify as any language with which he was familiar. Ugnai, Thafalka, Nga Ngurkulha, Bog Shagog. The next morning, Kaziah woke with no memory of the night before, but with severe abdominal pains. By noon, she had joined her adopted sisters as a woman. Of what occurred amongst the Masons over the next decade is subject to much rumour and little fact. That each of the sisters became betrothed is well documented. That early in 1656 the Cordelia East set for Jamaica, bearing all three sisters, their parents, and the three young men they were meant to marry, and the parents of those men, can also not be disputed. That the vessel reached Port Royal, and that the marriage of Abigail, Hepzibah, and Kaziah Mason to Simon Prynne, Jeremiah Watkins, and Robert Cummings seems also well documented. What happened next is a mystery, for in the fall the Cordelia East failed to return to Kingsport, and no word was had from any port along the American coast. It was on the 16th of October, 1658, that a black ship sailed into the harbour of Kingsport, and a rowboat manned by a short, dark-skinned man with wiry hair brought three cloaked figures to shore. Abigail, Hester, and Kaziah had returned, but the Cordelia East, her crew, and all the rest had been lost. According to the sisters, the ship had encountered rough weather and had been forced to seek refuge along the coast of Florida. What had happened there the Mason sisters would speak only in the vaguest of details. Of the Zeha Indians, who they claimed had seized the ship, and of the years they had dwelt amongst them, the sisters would not expound upon. Indeed, when pressed on the issue, the Masons did nothing but turn stone-faced and give quiet thanks to the strange swarthy figure that had brought them to shore, a man whom they fondly called Brown John. Within weeks of their return, the Masons sold off their properties in Kingsport and moved to Arkham, to the house on Parsonage Street. Here they lived, the three of them, widows at the age of 21, alone save for their man Brown John, a stocky man with brown skin and black eyes who tended the house and modest garden. Brown John only spoke a little English, but the Masons seemed to speak some of his language too. There was much speculation in the village about where Brown John had come from. Some thought him an African man, and others said he was a Hindu. But according to old Captain Holt, who had travelled some and seen more than others, Brown John was none of these. Holt said that he was from a people called the Chow-Chows, which were little better than savages, living deep in the wilds of Central Asia, on a mountain plateau called Liang. Brown John was not the only addition to the Mason household. In the parlour of their home, the sisters had installed a small tree encased in a large masonry pot. Around the tree was erected a cage of thin, wrought iron rod. Amongst the branches of the tree dwelt Brown John's pet, a small grey-furred monkey that they claimed was from the distant land of Sumatra. Those few who saw it up close claimed it to be in many ways like a large rat or possum, though the hands, face, and eyes were peculiarly like those of a man. The sisters affectionately called the beast Brown Jenkin, and when the weather was warmer, the beast could be seen travelling about the village, playfully riding on Kaziah's shoulder. It was in the fall of the next year that Eliza Abbott sent a letter to her sisters detailing the public rebuke of the villagers by one of the town's elders, her uncle Ambrose Abbott. The women of the village had noticed that the widows, who had always been slightly built, had all gained weight, and rumours abounded that they were each with child. Some went so far as to point fingers and suggest that Brown Jenkin was more than the servant he was made out to be. Whether it was the abbot's chiding, or the sudden onslaught of a bitter winter, little else was made of the Masons, and when May came and went with no birth, all rumours of illegitimate pregnancy were quelled. That said, there are some curious records that suggest some occurrence that yet still remains unexplained. That spring, James Annibal recorded an arrangement for a monthly standing order for a significant amount of meat and sundry items. The orders were to be paid by and delivered to Kaziah Mason. Now this in itself is not unusual, but that same month a similar arrangement was made with Harlan Fisher of Kingsport, to be paid for and received by Goody Watkins. Today the term Goody is unused, but in those days it was short for goodwife, and you would use it like we would use Mrs. or Ma'am. Thus it is with some assurance that Hepzibah Mason, known in Kingsport by her married name of Watkins, arranged a standing order for large quantities of fish and shellfish to be supplied on a monthly basis. Over the next years, the Mason sisters entrenched themselves with the citizens of Arkham, Kingsport, and Innsmouth, not only as good neighbours and customers to the merchants of all three villages, but also as midwives, a profession they seemed to excel at. They were particularly sought after by some of the older families in Kingsport, the Courts and Fishers, who seemed reluctant to seek medical attention under even the worst conditions. In 1660, much was made of their success in the birthing of Eliza Burke, whose mother had collapsed and gone into labour during Sunday services. The birth had been a breach, causing considerable injury to both the mother and child, which caused some concern amongst the family. That both lived, and after several days readily improved, seemed near miraculous, and earned the Masons the deepest of gratitude from both parents. Afterwards the sisters were much in demand, regularly servicing most of the more well-to-do families in the area, including the Carters, Pickmans, Whateleys, Marshes, Gilmans, Potters, Latimers, and Phillipses. By some estimates, 1 out of every 3 children born in Arkham was brought into the world by the Masons, who, despite the fine quality of their work, charged little if anything for their services. 20 years would pass, and the Masons began serving as midwives to the very children they had brought into the world. Arkham had begun to swell in size, and began to lay down the roads and structures that would guide its growth into a thriving city. The sisters were in their 40s and had lost much of the weight they had gained so many years before. Brown John had left them the summer before, though when exactly no one in particular could or would say. When pressed on the issue, the Masons would simply say that it was time for him to go. His services were no longer required. It was the spring of 1685 that the first sour note between the village and the sisters was raised. Arthur Marsh, owner of the Kingsport Mercantile Company, aged but still spry, had come to Arkham to visit his family, and after a chance encounter with one of the Masons related the most curious of tales. It was around 1670 when he, as captain of the Sandra D, took shelter from rough weather along the coast of Florida, and was attacked by the natives of the area, which the crew of the Sandra D was able to fend off. After some discussion, a militia was formed and the surviving raiders were tracked back to their crude settlement. There the good captain was to behold such sights and acts of indecent barbarism and crimes against God that he quickly ordered the entire village slaughtered. That those natives were the same as those that had seized years earlier the Cordelia East, Marsh had no doubts, for scattered amongst the village were timbers, crates, and sacks that still bore the marks of that ship. That the villagers themselves regularly feasted on human flesh, and that this had been the fate of those aboard the Cordelia East, was for Captain Marsh a foregone conclusion, and it was for this reason that he had ordered the massacre. That he did these things to prevent the villagers from ever again preying on ships in distress seemed to his crew a prudent and wise thing. What they could not understand is why he had taken a sledgehammer to the crude shell rock temple and collapsed it to the ground. Nor could the crew understand why he had ordered the bodies, the village, and the temple doused with kerosene and burned beyond recognition. The crew could not understand these things, for they had not entered the temple and had seen the tableau that decorated the walls within. They had not seen the crude but blasphemous paintings that showed the villagers carrying out their religious rites. They had not seen the image of the villagers kneeling before sanctified figures who were gleefully feasting upon human corpses. Marsh had seen these things, and he shattered them and burned them in an attempt to blot them from his memory, where they glowed like a horrendous beacon. For the figures that feasted in that tableau were a black man and 3 women dressed in white silk gowns, all with eerily identical features, which despite the crudeness of execution Marsh recognized as belonging to Abigail, Hepzibah, and Kaziah Mason. And the fare on the table was unmistakably the crew of the Cordelia East. The rumours of Marsh's tale swept through Arkham like a cold wind, turning the town bitter and mean. A summer drought hit the villages hard. Crops withered, cows went dry, and sows took to eating their own. Food, particularly meat, grew scarce. Rumours spread about strange sounds and violet lights emanating from the Mason house. In September the Derby household woke to the screaming of young Matthew, who had been roused from his sleep, he claimed, to find one of the Masons grabbing at his feet with her claw-like hands. When over the course of the next week Lucy Annabel and Jeremiah Upton reported similar nightmares, the townsfolk became restless and there was much talk in the square. Farmers and shopkeepers throughout Arkham refused to do business with them, and it was not unusual to see the 3 walking on the Innsmouth or Kingsport roads, their backs laden down with dry goods and fish. In late October tragedy struck, when Lamar Holt, a boy of just 7 years living with his family on the road to Kingsport, vanished. The boy's parents had been called to the barn to attend to a sick horse for several hours, and when they returned, the boy was gone without a trace. A desperate search throughout the night and next day in the surrounding woods found nothing. The parents, fearful and desperate, demanded that the Masons be questioned. The search party quickly became a mob that marched towards Arkham with obvious intent. Only the sudden intervention of a dozen well-armed men prevented the mob from storming the house and forcibly seizing the sisters. The following years were quiet for the sisters. Whether out of fear or age, all three ceased to visit Innsmouth or Kingsport. By 1687, their presence on the streets of Arkham was rare, and most of their food and supplies were delivered by members of the Jefferson family, who were employed by Ezekiel Chambers, a local man who had taken pity on the sisters. It was the Jeffersons who dismantled Brown Jenkins's cage and sold it to the local smith. What had happened to the cage's occupant was never specified, but it was assumed that the beast had died. Later that year, a wagon appeared in front of the Mason home, and the Jeffersons loaded it with a selection of furniture and crates. By noon, Abigail Mason, the widow of Simon Prynne, had left Arkham and never returned. Thus began a most strange and rapid exodus that culminated in early 1692. By one accounting, from 1688 to 1692, fully 15% of the villagers had left Arkham, and with them the vast majority of the children delivered by the Masons. Many made clear their destinations as the more urban and civilized cities of Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, or even Charleston. Others, such as the Wakeleys and Bishops, travelled northwest along the Miskatonic River, settling wherever they could, and founding the towns of Foxfield, Zoar, Duxbury, and New Dunwich. With the Wakeleys travelled Hepzibah Mason, widow of Jeremiah Watkins, who, like her sister Abigail, never again returned to Arkham. The departure of her sisters seemed to embolden Kaziah, who reportedly took to walking through the town and apparently peeking through windows at all hours of day or night. Fishermen and dock workers, who now seemed to dominate Arkham's growing waterfront, regularly reported seeing her on the marshy island in the middle of the Miskatonic River, though how she reached the island is not known. Children fled, and mothers crossed themselves as she hobbled down the road, her days as a respected midwife long forgotten as the town expanded on both sides of the river. The rumours of violet lights and strange noises proliferated. Tales told in roadhouses were retold in inns and exaggerated beyond belief. Any foul turn or ill luck was attributed to Kaziah Mason, whether it was lost livestock, a dry well, or a dead child. The rest of the story is well known. That it was Matthew Darby who accused Kaziah of witchcraft, and more than a dozen villagers would testify that they had been molested by her or her demon rat, Brown Jenkin, is a matter of public knowledge. That after days of torture, Kaziah Mason confessed, was sentenced to death, and mysteriously escaped, driving her guard mad, is also generally accepted. Yet for all this knowledge, both common and uncommon, that we had uncovered, more was yet to come. It was the middle of October of 1927 that Gilman cajoled me into travelling out to the island in the river. Gilman had become obsessed with tracking down as much about Kaziah as he could. We had already been to Kingsport and gone through the files of the Kingsport Mercantile Company, and while there Gilman had taken a rubbing from a gravestone that marked the plot of the long-dead stepsister for which Kaziah had been named. We had even travelled to that dark valley north of Meadow Hill and taken notes on the stone dolmens that lay scattered there. Unwilling to wait for more seasonable weather, Gilman and I made arrangements to borrow a small rowboat from one of the many unsavoury wharves that dot the Arkham harbour, and on the morning of October the 17th made our way out to the low, swampy island, braving the flotilla of barges that were endlessly moving up and down the river, transferring bales of unidentifiable cargo. We spent the morning creeping through the underbrush, searching for the standing stones that Reverend Phillips had described in his text, Thaumaturgical Prodigies in the New England Canaan. Gilman felt sure these were what had interested Kaziah in the island. It was difficult work, and we found ourselves assailed by vines, creepers, and roots at every turn. Thankfully, no insects or snakes seemed evident on the island, and I assumed that such creatures had all taken to their overwinter habitats. Likewise, there were also no birds, waterfowl or otherwise, on the island. This I took as curious, as in the last few weeks Arkham had seemed to be resplendent with the rustle of wings and the harmonious twittering and calls of all sorts, including doves, whippoorwills, thrushes, and the ever-filthy coterie of pigeons. That such abundance was not present on the island was somewhat unnerving. Moving into the uplands, we thankfully spied our first evidence of animal life on the island. In the bare mud tracks bordering the swamp, we could see the tracks of what could only be described as a raccoon or weasel of considerable size. Such a beast could easily and quickly depopulate an island of its resident beasts, and birds, particularly hatchlings, would be easy prey as well. Indeed, given the size of the tracks, Gilman and I both noted that such an animal could likely do us bodily harm as well. We climbed up the muddy hillside and discovered 3 irregularly spaced boulders that sprang up out of the earth, which we estimated at over 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Each was covered from pinnacle to base with strange shallow curves and angles, caked with a foul-smelling brown crust that I could not identify. That they were individual stones could have been of some dispute, for as we cleared away mud from the base, so as to reveal partially concealed carvings, we uncovered even more such carvings. Indeed, using some fallen branches as crude shovels, we dug for 3 or 4 inches and found no end to them, although we did find that the worn smoothness of the upper portions did not extend to the lower sections. The muddy ground of the island concealed jagged outcroppings and shards of loose rock, upon which I was unfortunate enough to slip against and suffered a short and shallow gash upon my ankle. Ill-equipped to mount a serious excavation, we resigned ourselves to the process of copying the glyphs as best we could. After several hours, the day turned cold, and after some insistence on my part, Gilman finally agreed to return to the mainland. Our trip back was uneventful, and we agreed to meet at the docks again the next morning. We made 2 more such trips to the island before we resolved that we had to our satisfaction captured all of the stone inscriptions. Though I will admit that our decision was also influenced by the somewhat pointed questions of several unsavoury characters who had taken too much of an interest in our outings. It was these drawings and rubbings that Gilman carried with him when in November he burst into Professor Upham's office, disturbing a meeting with the university president, Dr. Wainscott. Despite pleas from both, Gilman proceeded to ramble on at length on the most wild of notions concerning Kaziah Mason, the ancient markings, and certain things he had gleaned from the Necronomicon. What Gilman had said exactly he never did tell me, but whatever it was, it had earned him an unofficial rebuke from Upham and the department. His independent studies were suspended, all access to special holdings was revoked, and his classwork was reduced. He was ordered to visit Dr. Waldron, who after a brief examination and discussion suggested rest and prescribed a light sedative. It was then, in a disgruntled fit, that Gilman tried to distance himself from the university by moving out of the campus dormitory and into the vacant garret room of the witch house. That the landlord Dombrowski had not wanted to rent the room to anyone, let alone a wild-eyed student, was forgotten when Gilman offered to pay double the going rate. It was thus that we 2 came to be sitting around the common rooms of the house and discussing Kaziah Mason, when we were joined by another resident, Joe Mazurovich, who oddly enough had his own tale to tell about the old witch. Joe's father had been Polish, but his mother had been born of the old Burke family that had lived in Arkham since it was founded. According to Joe, The Burke family had long ago split between those that still lived in Arkham and those that had, like so many others, left the village about 1690. The split had come between two brothers, the older Lemuel and the younger Thaddeus. Upon the death of their father, Lemuel had inherited the family estate and documents, and amongst the papers he had found a sealed envelope addressed to him from their grandmother, Deborah Zellaby. The matron Zellaby wrote at length about observations she had made and grave concerns that she had, out of respect for her son and daughter, declined to discuss. However, in this letter, apparently written knowing her death was near, she made things plain to Lemuel, going into much detail on matters extremely strange. When Lemuel had finished reading the missive, he confronted Thaddeus, and under the threat of death ordered him to leave Arkham forever. The Zellaby letter has long since been lost, but its contents were passed down amongst the Burke family and formed the stuff of family legend. Lemuel Burke had been born to Eliza and Thomas Burke in 1657, and like his parents and all his relatives, he was a strapping, blonde-haired, blue-eyed specimen of health. Thaddeus Burke had been born in 1660, and it was his birth that the Mason sisters had helped with that gained them such fame as midwives. Thaddeus was the opposite of his brother, with dark hair, dark violet eyes, a pale complexion, and a thin, wiry build. At his birth, Deborah Zellaby had suspected something, but lacking evidence, she said nothing. It was through the course of years that Zellaby watched what was happening in the village. She watched the Masons and noted which children they birthed, which children died, and which children lived. Children brought into the world by the Masons flourished, while those that they did not tended to struggle to survive. This was particularly noticeable amongst the younger siblings of those children birthed by the Masons, who seemed prone to disease and the occasional lethal accident. All this the old matron wrote about in her letter, and all of it but the most circumstantial of observations. Yet it was the other thing that Burke had noted that had so enraged Lemuel and driven him to banish his brother Thaddeus. For his brother bore no resemblance to his family, and yet bore strong resemblance to the hundreds that had been born and thrived in Arkham since 1660, a whole generation which, regardless of family, had the same dark hair and dark violet eyes as the women who had supposedly only helped to bring them into the world: Abigail, Hepzibah, and Kaziah Mason. Despite the fact that Mazurovich was something of a drunkard, the story he told chilled me, and with my mind filled with what Deborah Zellaby had come to believe about her own grandson and the implications thereof, I found no comforting sleep that night. It was Mazurovich's tale that drove me to begin my own research into the life and legends surrounding Kaziah Mason. November came and went, and December brought us to winter break. Gilman went to visit family in Haverhill, and then to visit a new mill his family had built in Maine near Gates Falls. Given my rather meagre finances, I took the bus for the short journey to my home in Kingsport. There, amongst my friends and in my family home, I set about initiating my own more personal study of Kaziah's dark legacy. In February, our return to the ivory-columned halls of Miskatonic University brought us to the first hint of the supernatural. The incident was so simple, and yet it is undeniably the first in a series of preternatural events that would, in their course, lead Gilman first to madness and then to his singularly horrid death. Gilman and I made our way to the great library, cursing the masses that were uncommonly cluttered about the university grounds. It was not merely the student body that milled about the commons, but strangers as well, some of whom wore military uniforms and bore with them firearms and similar such weaponry. Others wore charcoal suits and travelled in pairs, dominating the sidewalks, oblivious to any other pedestrians they might come across. Ostensibly, these hordes had invaded Arkham in response to some secretive government action that had sealed off the aged port town of Innsmouth. Rumour had it that nearly the entire village had been arrested, charged with the smuggling of liquor and other contraband. The streets of Arkham were wild with speculation, and every titbit of unfounded speculation and gossip concerning Innsmouth seemed to travel across the city like wildfire. In the library, Gilman and I marched defiantly through the marble halls on a mission to persuade Dr. Armitage to restore Gilman's access to the rare bookroom in general, and the Necronomicon in specific. Unfortunately, both Armitage and the Necronomicon were already occupied. For the better part of an hour the old librarian stood watching as the most curious of characters sat hunched over the ancient grimoire, all the time making seemingly endless notations in an old leather journal. Gilman fumed over what he viewed as an invasion of his personal area of research, and when the stranger finally made to leave, speaking to Armitage in a rough and uncouth manner, Gilman rose to intercept the aged librarian. It was at this moment that Gilman had his first and cascading preternatural encounter. For as the stranger rose it was to reveal a countenance and stature that brought to mind the ogres and trolls of legend. The man easily stood over 7 feet tall, and his bulk was barely contained by his thread-worn suit and broken shoes. That a thin black tie and aged hat framed his face served only to draw attention to the man's huge and goatish head, which was covered by a thick beard and eyebrows that created the illusion of fur. That fine black hair was apparently endemic throughout the entirety of his body, for it peeked out at the cuffs of his sleeves, and several clumps were visible between the buttons of his shirt. As Gilman crossed his path, the lumbering giant paused and stared down at the diminutive man blocking his way. His gaze wandered in my direction and then back to Gilman. A massive hand reached out and came to rest on Gilman's shoulder. With little effort, the monstrous man gently moved Gilman to the side and grunted in a deep and curious way that reminded me more of the bellows made by frogs or whales than a true voice. What was more curious was what he actually said.
"You should know better than to stand in my way, sir."
And then he turned to look at me.
"And you should know better too, little cousin."
In those huge violet eyes I saw no empathy, no humanity, and if there was any evidence of emotion, all I could see was pure, unadulterated hate. Who the monstrous figure in the library was, and if it was his casual touch that brought on the ensuing events, I cannot say for certain. But it was on that very night that Gilman's bout of brain fever and strange dreams were to first manifest. Of the events that followed, of Gilman's dreams, of his ghostly encounters with Kaziah Mason and Brown Jenkin, of his involvement in the death of Ladislas Voleyko and his own tragic death, I have little to add. Some have questioned my whereabouts on certain evenings, and in response to these inquiries I must admit that I was pursuing the course of research that I had begun so many months before in Kingsport. Though my investigation had yielded nothing more than rumour, innuendo, and circumstantial evidence, I had, much like Deborah Zellaby, grown to suspect certain things about those early days of Arkham. It was not until that chance encounter in the library that my suspicions began to coalesce and provide a more concrete direction for my delving into history. It was in April that I borrowed a car and drove madly back to Kingsport. At my request, my brother had dug through the family holdings, and there, hidden among things long forgotten, he had found a portrait of the patriarch of the Elwood family, a man who had come to the village in 1691 as a pauper. That I and most of my family bore a resemblance to Thaddeus Elwood was never in doubt. This was not the revelation that my months of research had unveiled, for it was the second painting, the one that made little sense to be amongst our family possessions, that confirmed my worst fears. The painting was more than 250 years old, and still bore a note stating that it had been commissioned by Roger Mason to celebrate the 20th anniversary of his business venture. For in this painting of the Mason family, I could see the fine dark hair and dark violet eyes, the turn of the nose and chin, and the high rich cheeks that were the most notable features of the young Kaziah Mason, features that were reflected in the painting of Thaddeus Elwood, who had once been named Thaddeus Burke. Features I knew well, for I could see them in the face of the monstrous thing we had seen in the library as it played at being human, and in the face of Brown Jenkin as it burrowed out of Walter Gilman's chest and madly chatted at me. Features I madly see in every face around me, for there is, I fear, no choice but to accept the mathematical certainty that from those dozens of children that Kaziah and her sisters brought into the world, those children that fled Arkham like rats in the night, who have had more than 2 centuries to establish themselves, to marry and to raise children of their own, children with fine black hair and violet eyes, of which I myself may be only one of thousands. For the black goat mother doth favour her servants with such fruitfulness that would shame even the most fertile of pestilent flies, breeding in the secret wounds of man's misery and pain, like maggots in a slaughter yard.